Good morning, Woodland. Welcome back to our summer series on calling. We've been talking about how each one of us is called by God and how do we determine the shape of that calling. There's a great line out of one of George Bernard Shaw's plays, St. Joan, where the king is talking to Joan about the fact that she hears voices. And he said, I don't understand why you hear voices and I don't hear voices. After all, I'm king. And she replies, say, they do come to you, but you do not hear them. You have not sat in the field in the evening listening for them. When the Angelus rings, you cross yourself and have done with it. But if you had prayed from your heart and listened to the thrilling of the bells in the air as they stopped ringing, you would hear the voices as well as I do. Well, we're all wanting to know more about how God speaks to us. And today we have two delightful folks who've discovered their callings in and out of the church. And I can't wait to hear from Martha and from Al. You all know them well, but you need to know them even better because they have much to teach us. This morning, I want to try something a little different. I'd like for you to introduce one another. Tell us a little bit about each other.
Well, I'm married to a physician, specifically a pediatric pulmonologist. When I told a friend from New Mexico that I was dating a pediatric pulmonologist, he said, "No, you need to date a psychiatrist, but that's what you really need." Martha is a physician, but more than that, she's really a missionary. Her parents, Dr. Morris and Esther Ruth Morris, both medical missionaries to Colombia for a decade. Um, but I think Martha is really a missionary in her own right. We were conducting a missionary uh, endeavor at Floresville during my first years as a pastor at Woodland. And I watched how she related to the people at Floresville. She spoke their language. She looked at them with I can only say with a look of compassion. It reminded me of the ministry of Jesus as described in the Gospels, where he looked upon the crowds with compassion, meaning to suffer with. Now she's really in charge of the church. She's chair of the deacons. The staff doesn't know that, though.
Oh, I think we
She's
do.
chair. the the chair of the deacons, as chair of deacons, she has really begun a ministry to those who are homebound, those who attend church regularly by leading the deacons to visit regularly those who cannot attend church regularly. So I present to you Dr. Martha Morris.
Well, Martha, how about Al? Who is this guy that you're sitting next to?
Well, this is my husband, Al. We will have been married 5 years in about 10 days. Al had had a year of chaplaincy training, had served in the role of youth minister, music minister, senior pastor before coming to Woodland. But he had this talent that I don't know we knew about before he came, of acting, that came out when he was in high school and was further developed when he was in the Army. He was drafted during the Vietnam War, but and trained as a weapons specialist, but somehow escaped deployment and instead special services where he entertained the troops.
Both of you have had callings that have evolved. Tell us a little bit about your careers and how those started. Did you describe your call from God? Did you have some kind of Damascus Road experience that spoken to you in a mystical way? Or how did God
Yeah.
communicate with you?
As a missionary kid, I at a very young age, felt that I was part of this missionary family. When I was 4 years old, we were in a tropical climate and had spent days searching for a place to live. And I was finally frustrated and said, just what are we doing? And my father, pretty exasperated, said, we're looking for a place to live. And I, equally exasperated, said, well, when are we going to start telling people about God? So I had a very early sense of the fact that that was our calling. And so my maternal grandparents were missionaries in Brazil, and my mother's brother and wife were missionaries in Brazil. It was the family business. And I just knew that I was part of this and their ability to witness for Jesus. I knew that my parents did it from the standpoint of medicine, and my grandparents and uncle did it as preachers. When I was 9 years old, I saw the movie Debbie Reynolds. It ends with this scene in Africa where she finally is able to give a shot to a child, something that she was very afraid of doing. And I was very afraid of receiving, particularly traumatized by our yearly typhoid shots. And when she gave the shot, the movie ends and the music swells and the camera pans out on a village that just adores her, and the children surround her with great love. And I thought, that's me in the future. And since my mother was a nurse and my father was a doctor, I knew that my destiny was to be a nurse in a foreign country. Well, I grew up in a hospital. I used to tell people by the time of the summer after fifth grade, I was going to the hospital with my dad and running errands, largely for medical records, but they would send me to different parts of the hospital. And when I got to go to the pediatric clinic, I would find excuses why it took me longer to run that errand, and largely because I would try to melt into the walls and observe what was happening to the wards, and was allowed to go upstairs and assist on whatever was happening with the inpatients. In sixth grade, very monumental thing happened in my life. A girl from the United States and her family moved to Barranquilla, Colombia, and Melissa was everything I wasn't. She was tall, she was beautiful, she was popular, and she announced that she was going to be a pediatrician. And I thought, oh, whoa, if she can be a doctor, I can be a doctor. But I'm not going to tell anyone because I think I'm just copying Melissa. Well, incidentally, she became a radiologist and we are still friends. But anyway, I don't remember when I finally told my family by high school, set on that trajectory. Now, if you'd asked me, had I heard a verbal call from God, I wouldn't have told you that. However, when there were crises, of which there were multiple ones through my career, Some occurred in high school when I didn't feel like I was performing up to snuff for what it was going to take to be a doctor. I would have a come to Jesus meeting with God and have to surrender and say, now, is this really my call? Did I get this straight from you or not? Frequently, these were in the shower or bathtub. Running water seemed to be a good time to have a talk with the Lord. And I would have a feeling of deep peace come over me. You've got it right. This is what you are to do. Medical school was a difficult time for a variety of reasons, and training afterwards, particularly internship, was a very difficult time. And I saw a lot of painful things. I saw parents mistreat children. I saw children suffer terribly. I had crises of faith that there was a good God and that indeed this was my calling, that I was going to spend my life devoted to this, questioning whether this was what I was supposed to do. And I watched a movie about Mary and Joseph, and Mary was portrayed as about a 14-year-old little girl. And I began to relate to what she was going through with unplanned pregnancy, the shame, and then the difficulty. And of course, I knew the story very well of the pain of losing her son, which I didn't quite relate to at that time, have come to relate to since. And my anger just dissolved because I felt like God called her to do something very difficult. And here was this child that did it. And who was I to be belly aching about this difficult role? And I also lost my anger at God, seeing Jesus incarnate, both as a baby and then knowing the story of him growing up and suffering. And so that was a very meaningful time for me to say, yes, God, this is what I'm about. So again, no one Damascus Road experience, but several reaffirmations along the road that this was where I was to go and serve God.
Al?
Al?
Well, I would have to say that my dear mother has been the greatest influence in my life, especially spiritually. She was the consummate parent, mother to the five of us, her children. She exhibited the traits, I think, just of the life of the person of Jesus in such a unbelievable way. And she continues to speak to me at different times and different periods of my life. She During that early period of our lives, my childhood and going to that church, the Highway Baptist Church of McAlmont, Arkansas, that large city and metropolis of about 1,500 people, there was the religion I picked up was pretty much a fear-based faith. I basically committed my life. A great deal of it was due to being afraid of going to hell. I mean, any child that could think even tiny bit would say, "No, I don't want to go to hell. I'll do whatever it takes to not go to hell." So I not only made a profession of faith, but I also made a decision to pursue a full-time service as a very young Christian. My my original concept of going into the ministry was to help people, escape hell, to see that they were saved. They, would become a Christian. I met another mentor in the person of James Dunn, who uh, characterized a zany sense of humor. I never thought a minister could be that funny and irreverent. Uh, and he embodied both those characteristics. Another characteristic he embodied was a concern for justice. And I had not up to that point seen a man who was so passionate about seeing justice in the world. And he exhibited that in his role with the Baptist Committee on Public Affairs in Washington, D.C. He was trying to help people wake up and see what's happening to Baptists. And he seemed to be possessed with this passion of trying to shake up churches and to pay attention. He was moderately successful to that end because people did not want to hear all of it, and he was responsible for me going to Harvard Divinity School as a fellow. He was primary reason that I was chosen as one of four uh, practicing ministers from the mainline traditions of the United States. And he later said, "Oh, Al, don't take it seriously. They just want to study a Southern Baptist." Probably true. But out of that experience at Harvard, I came under the influence of another mentor, Harvey Cox, who was my advisor during my year of study at Harvard. And Harvey really exemplified a sense of the eclectic spirit. He pulled truths from all kinds of places. He was a Baptist. He still is a Baptist. And so he was a good model for me in studying Latin American liberation theology. Now that's really a stretch. A kid from Texas or really from Arkansas uh, who is studying something like liberation theology. Explain that one. But really, it took for me, I think, because I in modest circumstances, we were pretty close to poor. We were just poor, but it connected with me, and so he also introduced me to the person and the legacy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And that caused a major change in my theology, in the way I looked at myself as a Baptist, and the way I looked at Christianity. And changes started taking place radically. So much so that in 1988, while I was still pastoring in Portales, I put together a play that I called A View from the Underside, a legacy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And it's set in the prison cell where Bonhoeffer spent 2 years of his life before his execution. And he talked about looks different when you're on the underside, when you're in a situation of powerlessness. And what I began to realize is that while I was studying Bonhoeffer in prison, I was learning about people from Central and South America who were doing theology from the underside. And that really challenged me. And it challenged all the presuppositions I had about what it meant to be a person of faith, and especially a minister. So it was a struggle at times at Portales, because most of them were Republicans, most of them were very conservative Southern Baptists. And it's as if when I finished Harvard, God must have said, you know, it's impressive you've gone to Harvard. Now see what you can do down here in Portales. So I know God has a sense of humor. And then I came to Woodland, and but I couldn't seem to shake this need to perform these new truths that I had come to about the view from the underside and liberation theology. And it finally came to a head in 1993, my last year as pastor. In January of that year, uh, Rabbi Sam Stahl invited me to speak, to perform at Shabbat at Temple Bethel. And as he said later, he said, "You received a standing ovation and you merited it greatly." And I thought, wow, now that's a response. You know, it's not Baptist, it's not Christian, it's coming from a group other than Christians. It's and so it made an impact upon me. Then later, I would be asked to speak, perform at the National CBF convention in Birmingham. And of course, then and later in the year, I was invited to perform at the National Cathedral in Washington, and there I was invited in honor of the opening of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And by the way, that was the second time I had been invited to speak at the National Cathedral. I had been invited the year before to present Bonhoeffer. So then in the fall, Trinity Church in New York, that great church, invited me as their fall artist to perform Bonhoeffer. And I thought, wow, this is getting serious. Then in November of 93, Henry Nouwen, the man who I became with during my time of study at Harvard, invited me to L'Arche Daybreak community to perform Bonhoeffer in that most unusual and different kind of context. And I spent 3 wonderful days with my dear friend. So all of that and then more. I was that year also. I did 3 endowed lectureships at different colleges. So, you know, what kind of message do you need to hear to get the point? And so that end of that year, the decision was made to leave the pastorate and go into this full time, just to get on with it. And I felt really at peace, you know, as I entered that year, because I knew where my heart was, I knew where my passion was, and others were responsive. And during the question and answer times at the end of the performance, it was amazing to hear the responses of people. They seemed to at least get part of what I was trying to say. There was never a time when I was criticized or taken, you know, 101 and challenged in any way that, you know, so it further confirmed that I was in the right place.
Well, you are still performing Bonhoeffer all over. Both of you was there ever someone, a teacher or a colleague that helped you with your calling, that gave you some advice that kind of pushed you forward?
You know, interestingly enough, it was a professor of theater at Eastern New Mexico University. I performed this first time for him by himself. In fact, he was head of the department. And I did it fearfully because I thought, you know, this guy's an expert. And he said, you became, he said, when I saw you perform, I forgot that you were you.
Um,
You're
what a compliment.
you're more. So that helped a great deal to guard me from, delusions of grandeur, which we all suffer from.
Martha, how about you? Anybody in the family or in your studies?
I would just have to say that my parents were very supportive of my pursuit in medicine.
Well, I'm glad they were because you overcame a lot of obstacles. There weren't a lot of women physicians in those days, were there?
No, there were not. And that was a difficult obstacle to overcome.
Yeah. What part did the church play in all this? Did it help you with your calling and articulating your calling?
The church was obviously very important to me growing up as a missionary kid. Life revolved around church, Christianity, helping people. So very influential in that way. However, as I got older, I would say college, medical school, the issue of being a woman called to ministry was becoming more and more of a contentious point in Southern Baptist life. Interestingly enough, on the mission field, the non issue in churches, women served. My mom, my aunt were both very involved. But coming back to the United States and the Southern Baptist Convention going through its brouhaha, um, I began to say, what are you talking about here? I felt as called um, to by the Lord as uh, any woman, be it to be a pastor or anything. And so I took it quite personally, this discussion about women not being called by God. And also, uh, I had a classmate who was in my Sunday school class at church and say to me, well, I can grant you that God could call you to be a doctor, but I don't see how he could call you to be a wife, a doctor, and a mother. So those were difficult times. Fortunately for me, I was in a church during medical school that um, took a year to discern whether women uh, could be called by God to be, say, deacons. And at the end of the time, it decided yes, and actually ordained women. And then when I moved to San Antonio, I was directed to Manor Baptist, and it was a non-issue there. And obviously, it's been a non-issue at Woodland. So that was very fortunate for me.
Al, how about you?
Oh, they don't have a course, a degree course. It's this Southwestern, or didn't when I was there, that prepared you to be a performing artist. There's, in fact, there wasn't in college at Hardin Centers. I mean, Hardin Simmons. But I had to learn through the affirmation and confirmation of church congregations that this was a calling for me. It was the responses I would hear following a performance, that over and over and over again. I have to say, I think I was a pretty fair preacher. but I didn't receive the kind of response as a pastor, not nearly as the kind of responses I received as a performing artist. And, I like to say suffering is highly overrated. At times, it was with real nervous anticipation that I would walk to the pulpit and preach, because I knew that if I had done my homework and was preaching uh, what I believe was the truth, that it may not hit home for everybody. In fact, the sure sign that you probably did hit home in some cases was that somebody didn't agree with you. Because if everybody agrees with you all the time, you're not preaching. You're not preaching. You're not preaching the prophets either. So, but that Bonhoeffer, because I was in a different character, because Al entered the character of Bonhoeffer, somehow I was able to convey things that I could never do as a pastor. I could challenge patriotism when it would gone too far. I could challenge Christianity that was basically cheap grace and not. It was more Constantinian Christianity than the real Christianity. So yeah, the churches had a great deal in confirming that this was my calling.
Remarkable testimonies. Thank you both. Is, is there any is there anything you would say to Woodland about its calling?
Well, obviously, Woodland has been very important to me since I've been there since the beginning. And we used to refer to it as the Church of the Second Chance. I think it's more the third or fourth chance in my case. But I felt included as a woman when I got to Manor, supported as a woman. I felt that way at Woodland on a whole lot of different fronts. And so I think the calling for Woodland is to continue that sense of inclusivity for everyone that wants to be in communion with us.
Coming to Woodland was a breath of fresh air. I was thrilled because I'd been in a church, a very loving church. Portales was, despite the fact that they were very conservative generally, they were a very loving church, but it was always a challenge theologically to preach in ways that were true to me and also would be beneficial to them. And so when I came to Woodland, I was amazed that they had moved on the women's issue, and I thought that was a very important issue for church to make a decision on, especially in the climate of Southern Baptist life at that time, because it was a war, and it wasn't a holy war either. But I brought with me a lot of concerns that I had been exposed to in terms of racism, war, justice between nations, that were to me were as theological as anything else, and just as true for me. And I thought that this was the kind of thing that my hope was that Woodland would continue to move on those issues, and it has on some of the issues. And so my encouragement is to not just stop with one issue. There are other issues on the front that are crying for people of faith to respond to. And so we can't, I think you can't stop it, and say, oh, that's it, no more. once your conscience has been pricked, you have more work to do, and it's a wonderful challenge. And I think Woodland is the place to do that challenging work. So I have hopes continually for that to continue under the direction of Garrett.
Thank you both. I mean, you've given us all kind of insights about ministry and about calling, and we appreciate your time and we appreciate your wisdom. Continue to lead us.